How to Buy a Business Part 2. If you missed Part 1, what I covered in Part 1 were some of the softer details about how do you find a business, where can you find them, what are some of the first things that you need to do. And where we left off with Part 1 was having established a baseline of what roughly the seller would kind of be prepared to consider and what you would kind of be prepared to pay for a business. So in this episode, what I'm talking about specifically is how do you pay for the deal? How do you actually pay for the purchase of a business? The assumption that I'm making is if you're watching this or listening to this, that we're trying to do this without using a lot of money. We're going to use our sweat equity. We're going to use our knowledge, our experience, our relationships, our effort, and we're going to try to work our way into a business. And this is because many small business owners who are baby boomers don't really have an exit plan for their business. In fact, most of them would sooner just hand the business to somebody if it was easy and simple and clean and wasn't very complicated. And so in this part 2 of 3, I'm going to talk about how do you do that? How do you make it worthwhile for the seller and you as the buyer? How can you purchase a business without needing to write a very big check or take on a ton of debt? So the first thing that I want to talk about is how do you intend on paying for the business? Even before watching these episodes in your head, how did you think you were going to buy a business? Maybe you thought, I'll leverage the equity in my home. Maybe I'll sell some assets. Maybe I have some investments. Maybe I got a payout package from a job that I was at. But the first thing to figure out is what do you actually have to work with? Is it purely sweat equity? Because that's good to know. Is it cash? That's good to know as well. Or is it a mixture of both? And it's always important to understand what do you have to work with before you get going too far. Because as I talk through in the next couple of minutes here about how to put the strategy together, you're just going to want to know in the back of your mind, what do you have to work with? So first thing that I like to bring to your attention is that this is key, most small business owners who are baby boomers don't necessarily want a big fat check. And the reason for that is not because they don't want the big fat check. It's because they know their business probably isn't worth a big fat check. Their business probably, they know, is maybe worth 3 or 4 times what they are taking out of it in profit or in payroll or through a management fee or a dividend. And so in a perfect world, they would want to keep earning income while they hand the responsibility of the business off to somebody else. Now, the reason that works well for the example that we're using today, or for the context that we're using today, is because I've said I'm trying to share with you ideas on how to purchase a business without using any real cash or having to write a check or taking on debt. So once you figured out what you have to work with, what you're going to realize is one of the things that you have to work with is time. If you listen to part 1, I talked about how important time is, because the longer a deal goes, usually the less you can get it for. Conversely, if a deal has to go faster, it means you're going to pay more. But using the baseline that you established from part 1, the next part is to try and craft the deal. How are you going to go to the owner and give them a deal that makes sense? So I will use an example that I gave to somebody last week that might help form some of your thinking. So it went something like this. The individual said, yeah, this particular business, it does about $1 million a year, just over $1 million a year gross revenue, and it nets the owner about $250,000 bucks. And I said, great. And I said, so how are you going to pay for the business? Well, I've got some savings. I could probably put up a mortgage on my home. I could probably, find a way to come up with $500,000 to $750,000, which is kind of what I think the owner wants. And what I ended up saying to this particular individual, I said, well, if it turns out that the owner doesn't really want to get out of the business in any short time frame, maybe the best thing that you could do is, and we started talking through it. I said, first of all, do you have any ideas for the business? Do you have anything that you can bring to the table that would help the business go from $1 million to $1.3 million? So we talked a little bit about the lack of a customer relationship software system. He had previously owned a digital marketing agency and had sold it. And part of the appeal for this business is he saw that the business really was very traditional and wasn't taking advantage of technology, and really felt like he could bring that to the table. So I said, great. Then why don't you do something like this? Why don't you say to the owner, over the next 2 years, keep taking out of the business what you have taken out of the business. I will come to work for the business for free. But anything that I'm able to generate for this business over and above what you have done over the last 3 years, I get a piece of. So all of a sudden you get thinking about that, and he thought that was a pretty good idea, because he said he didn't necessarily need any money. And in fact, as we talked through it, he says, well, the truth is, if I ended up putting any money into this business, it's basically the money that I'm going to be using to pay myself. So maybe that makes sense. Go to the business owner, let him know he can stay in the business for the next 2 years, continue to take out of the business what he has been taking out over the last couple of years on kind of a normalized basis, because everybody knows COVID sort of threw everything out, but you can still kind of get a pretty good baseline for what the business should be doing. So he said, great, I'll go to the business owner, stay in the business 2 years, take out your wage, but anything that I generate over and above $1 million a year, I get to keep the profit on. And that will be my way of working into the business. And so that seemed to make a lot of sense. So when he said, okay, well, then what do I do after 2 years? And I said, okay, well, first of all, what was the baseline number that you said that you and him agreed that this business might be worth? And he said, well, I kind of think it's probably somewhere between like $500,000 and $750,000. And I said, okay, but if over the next 2 years, he's prepared to take his wage out, but not put in 40 hours a week, because over time you are going to now take on that role while you're growing the business, then what would you need to pay him? And he said, well, obviously it would have to be a better deal than the baseline. So if he wanted $500,000, but in the next 2 years took out $500,000, then really all I need to pay him is some sort of bonus or some sort of some amount of cash to make it worth hanging around for the next 2 years in any capacity. So he says, you know what I could do? He said, the inventory, there's a lot of inventory, there's a little bit of equipment, but maybe what I can do is, worst case scenario, 2 years from now, I go and borrow some money against the equipment in the inventory, and then I just write him the check. Or if I didn't want him to hang around for the next 2 years, I could go and maybe get a term loan from the bank for a percentage of the revenue, or rather what the business would be valued at if a banker were to look at it. And I could just cut him the check. So all of a sudden, that baseline of $750,000 gave this potential purchaser something to push and pull on to figure out how to structure a deal. Now, at this stage, you're not necessarily putting it down on a sheet of paper, but rather starting to put together the deal points. In part one, you would have figured out all of the motives and the incentives and the desires of the owner. So here in part two, we're really just trying to figure out, how do you pay for that? If you want to use sweat equity, one of the ways to do it is to bring something to the table that the current owner could benefit from. In the example I just gave you, the current owner was benefiting by saying, I can keep taking out my wage, you're going to take over managing the business, and you've said you won't take any money out of the business unless you can grow my top line past what I've been doing for the last couple of years. Well, shoot, that sounds like a pretty good deal. And at the end of 2 years, you're going to cut me a check for some amount of money. It sounds like maybe you'll give me another couple $100,000. I kind of like that deal. So that's an example. There's a dozen different ways to talk through that, but that's kind of the very basic structure that can be used to purchase almost any small business run by a boomer who is an owner operator. This doesn't necessarily work if the business is owned by someone who isn't actively working in the business. And the reason for that is, an owner operator that's a boomer who's run the business for 20 or 30 years, they just want out. They're not so concerned about cash. They're more concerned about, how do I actually untangle myself from this business? And instead of working 5 days a week, can I work 4 days a week? Can I work 3 days a week? Can I continue to draw some income over the next couple of years while I start to transition myself into retirement? And that's really where the golden opportunity is. The golden opportunity is to find these businesses, figure out what you can bring to the table, because the truth of it is, any money that you put in is probably just the money you're going to take out to pay yourself anyway. So why not structure a deal that works for both you and for the potential seller of the business? So once you figured out what you can add as sweat equity, then the next thing to figure out is what could be financeable. And in the example I just gave you, this potential purchaser had said, well, there's some inventory and some equipment, and I could probably get the bank to lend against that for me if I needed to generate some cash to pay off the seller quicker than normal. And so once you have figured out what you have to work with, once you have figured out how to address the pressure points of what the current owner is looking for, then you can really just craft a deal where you just work your way into the deal. And it becomes very, very simple after that. The hardest part really is just trying to take a big block of clay and just roughly shape it into the sculpture that it's going to be. But by this moment, so part one helps you take off some big pieces. Part two now helps you start to whittle it a little closer. And now what you're going to do is you're simply going to be moving the terms around a little bit. Maybe the owner says, okay, that sounds good, but you know what? Maybe I'd like to take my wage for 3 years. I'll work full-time in year one, part-time in year two, and then year three is a freebie. I don't have to work at all. But if you need me to show up once a month to answer questions or to maintain some customer relationships, I'm happy to do that. So once you have kind of taken the big pieces off, you're starting to shave this thing down into a smaller deal. Then part three is now, how do you actually hit the ground running? You've got, in part one, you addressed the business and found it and were able to talk to the owner about it. Make sure that you're addressing all of their concerns and their pressure points. Part two is now, how are you going to finance the deal? What's really important to the owner? Chances are it's not purely cash. It's mostly going to be weighted towards removing themselves from actively running the business and being responsible for it. They're going to maybe want to take a few extra days a week off or a month or what have you. So once you figured that out, then you just have to kind of structure your deal around how you're going to pay for it. How much of it will be sweat equity? Is any of it financeable? Do you need to put your own money in to begin with? Maybe the owner says, look, you put in 50 grand, I'll give you 2 years, I will walk away and I'll finance it for you. I mean, that's, again, kind of the simplest deal in the world to do. An owner says, look, here are the keys. You can pay me whenever you have the money, and don't even worry about paying me quickly, because I have no need for the money. I'm way more interested in just getting rid of all of the work that this business is right now. So you've kind of just got to figure out what do you have to work with. But what I think stands out, and for me, I talk about it very easily because I have some experience with it, but if you've never done this before, I think you'd be surprised to learn that most owners don't just want a big fat check. If they do want a big fat check, the chances are you're not going to get a crack at the deal anyway, because it's most likely being done through a business broker or it's being done through an M&A firm. But if you were able to find the deal, if you were able to find the owner and you found someone that says, yes, I'd like to sell, but I haven't really done any work towards it, then you can start moving the deal down this path that we've talked about in part one and part two. So as we move into part three, what we're going to be moving into is, now, how do you spend your time as the potential acquirer of this business? What are you going to do day 1, day 30, day 60, within the first year? How do you hit the ground running and make sure that you can maximize your investment? So hopefully you found this particular episode helpful. And as we move into the next phase, by the time you're done listening and watching part 3, you really could just pick up the phone and start structuring a deal. And I would encourage you, reach out to me. There's a link somewhere that says book a call. We can chat about it. I can take what I have talked about philosophically and really craft it and break it down into what it might mean for you specifically if you're looking at purchasing a business. And it's very common. I get the question all the time. Hey, Dylan, I'm looking at purchasing this business. What do you think? And I love hearing myself talk and working through the variables, and I'm quite comfortable with them. So it might be helpful for you just to hear someone else talk about your deal and some of the things that you should know, and make sure that you find a way to connect, because I would definitely love to help. So find your way over to part 3, where we talk about how to buy a business, and then what do you do once you're now in there.